Imagine a world where generosity, collaboration, and caring are the norm. A world that's within your reach. I'm Gale West, and this is Reality Reimagined, where we break boundaries, elevate your spirit, and turn your world into something extraordinary. As the best-selling author of Money Come Dance With Me and your guide on this incredible journey, I'm here to challenge the ordinary and introduce you to the extraordinary. We stand at the edge of one of the most thrilling evolutionary leaps in human history, from unraveling ancient mysteries to diving into cutting-edge science, spirituality, and the emerging economies. This is your front row seat to the future. Together with visionaries from around the globe, we'll explore who are we and who are we becoming, and how can we reshape reality. Reality Reimagined begins now. Get ready to transform. We are on Reality Reimagined, and I'm coming to you from sunny Los Gatos, California. And Mark, I have my guest, Mark Gober. I'm so excited. Where are you, Mark?
I am currently in sunny Vancouver.
Wow. Okay. And Mark Gober is an award-winning author and an international speaker. His book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, was awarded the Best Science Book of 2019. His 7 books span the topics of consciousness science, politics, economics, medicine, cosmology, and more. He serves on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the School of Wholeness and Enlightenment. He's a Princeton graduate, a former investment banker, and a former partner at the Silicon Valley strategy firm. Welcome, Mark. So happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Gale.
Okay. So I know that you started out with not on this path at all. So tell us your journey. What is your journey?
My journey. Well, I started off, let's just say, with a non-spiritual perspective on life. And the older I got and the more I learned in school and just from science in general, the more I thought that we lived in a universe that is fundamentally random and meaningless, meaning that there isn't any purpose that's built into the fabric of reality itself. And rather we could make up meaning and rationalize it in our own mind, but there's nothing fundamental about meaning or purpose, and everything's random. So it's a very nihilistic perspective. Some might call it agnostic or atheistic. That was the mentality I came from. And I was working in the business world. So when I graduated from Princeton in 2008, I moved to New York and was working in investment banking. This was during the heart of the financial crisis. So that was quite an interesting time to be there.
Yeah.
And I was there until 2010. And then I left to join a Silicon Valley-based strategy firm where I spent about 10 years and eventually became a partner at the firm. And while I was working at that firm in 2016, I started listening to podcasts. Initially, they were business podcasts and then alternative health. And on one alternative health podcast, I heard a woman talk about psychic abilities that she was actually using with her clients. And she spoke about things like communicating with non-physical beings. And then I listened to more podcasts like it, because initially when I heard this one woman, her name's Laura Powers, talk about it, I didn't know how to even contextualize what she was saying, because she sounded like she was very serious. I didn't think she was lying, but I couldn't tell if she was delusional or how could any of these things be true. But then I heard,
like, where are you coming from?
Because I had no way to, I had never experienced those things.
Context, right?
I had no context, and no one I knew in my world and talked about these things. And I understood the implications, like, whoa, if even a fraction of what she says is real, that's a big thing.
Yeah.
But then I heard more and more people say this, basically the same thing, and they had different backgrounds, and they were drawing a picture of reality where there is meaning and it isn't random, and there is some kind of purpose and some kind of spiritual underpinning to things. So then I started to read books and scientific papers, and I came across the Institute of Noetic Sciences for the first time, where I
Yeah.
now serve on the board, the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, where they're studying children with past life memories and near-death experiences, and the U.S. government's psychic spying program. These were all things that I had never heard of before.
Yeah, a
And
lot of people didn't know about the psychic spying. That was in the 60s.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
and Russell Targ and Hal
Yep,
Puthoff,
yep,
and,
yep,
and this,
yep,
they were
yep.
laser physicists. So I didn't even know what to do with myself when I first learned of all this, because I was on this mainstream business track, and now I was having my whole literal context for the nature of reality itself turned upside down.
Yeah,
And at the
right.
time, I wasn't planning on writing books or speaking publicly. I just wanted to understand what was going on. And that has led me on a journey now to write many books and eventually leave my firm, because there are so many layers to try and understand what's going on.
So it's quite interesting. When do you have this aha that, oh my God, I think I have to write a book about this? And I'm curious about how you could navigate the world that you were living in, and while you were going through all of this, because it had to have been maybe disconcerting in some ways, or like, yeah, because you were in a very different world and now you're in a very different world.
It was really challenging, because
Yeah.
what happened was that I would spend all of my time not in the office on trying to understand the nature of reality and consciousness, and reading books to see what's actually real and what's not. So I would have to switch gears very quickly. I'd be reading about this crazy stuff, and then I'd go back into a client meeting and had to switch into something so different where it was really high pressure. And I just got used to it after a while. But it was maybe a year into doing this kind of research where I said, I've learned so much. Why don't I summarize my findings and put it into a book? And maybe, like a lot of other people have written about this, but maybe because I have a business background, there will be other people with a business background that will be maybe more inclined to read my work. And I was getting a lot of positive feedback just talking to certain friends about this information, because I would bring to them some of the best evidence that I came across. And this would be over dinner or brunch or something.
Mhm.
And they'd say, wow, Mark, that's a huge deal. I've never heard of that before. Whoa. And then they would tell me afterwards, Mark, I'm still thinking about the conversation we had.
Mhm.
So I knew that there was something that I was getting across. And I just said, well, why don't I'll put this on paper, and I'll do what I do in my professional job, because I used to basically take a lot of complex material related to technology and intellectual property and put it into a business strategy context for boards of directors, senior management teams, for sometimes publicly traded companies, sometimes startups too. So I was very used to having to synthesize a lot of complex stuff and make it digestible for people. That was my job. I said,
Mhm.
well, why don't I do that with this other stuff that I'm interested in, and I'll have all the citations there so it won't sound crazy. Look, they can see the peer-reviewed science.
Mhm.
And I had a long weekend in 2017. This was a year into my research, where it was the 4th of July. So I knew I would have a little bit of time, and I was actually coming up on a huge project at work. So I said, I've got to finish as much as I can of this book right now. So I ended up doing more than half the book that weekend. And what I didn't finish then, I knew exactly what it was going to be and had all of my sources lined up. So it was relatively easy at that point to then fill in the rest. So I got it done in a compressed amount of time. And then really the rest is history. I was fortunate to get to have Bill Gladstone from Waterside Productions responded to my email when I said I had a new book, and I had a literary agent all of a sudden, and then he published the book. So things spiraled from there.
Wow.
But the initial inclination just kind of came. I remember I was about to drive to work one day. I lived in San Francisco, and our office was down in the Valley. And before I left for work, I said, why don't I write a book about this? And then my knee jerk was, well, could you really write a book that's a little too crazy? You're in the business world. It's going to take a lot of time. But then quickly I said, no, you could do this. Just take some time. You've studied so much.
Mhm.
Interestingly, Gale, after I wrote the first book, and last time we saw each other in person, I'd only written one book.
It was
I thought
2018, right? 2019?
I think it was 2019.
Yeah, right.
And because the book came out in the fall of 2018. And
Yeah.
I was, okay, this is the book that I wrote. That's it. I'm not going to write any more. And it just keeps coming. Here we are a few years later.
Yeah. So the book that I just finished reading was, I said, well, I reached out to Mark and I said, I love your work. I want you to be on my show. What would you recommend the next book? Because you've written 7 books, right?
Mhm.
Like, hello, that's a lot. And based on all these different topics. And the one that you would recommend was the end to upside down living, right?
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about the transition between where you were and where you are now, and just talk to our audience about your perceptions of reality as you know it, and give them some evidence that kind of convinced you that, oh my God, I'm onto something.
The way I used to look at life, there's a term for it in science. It's known as materialism or physicalism. These are philosophical terms that describe like the building blocks of reality. And materialism and physicalism basically say that the building blocks of reality are physical. It's made of physical stuff. And that means everything in the cosmos, including the human being and the human consciousness, is coming from matter.
Yeah.
The implication there is that if our body's made of matter and our consciousness, which is our subjective awareness, it's our capacity for experience, if that very fundamental thing that we all have right now, our consciousness is active, which is it's interpreting everything that's happening, it's registering it all. But without our body, under materialism or physicalism, we wouldn't have that consciousness. So that means when the physical body shuts down, it's like a computer shuts off, that's the end of your consciousness. There's no afterlife. There's no past lives, certainly. There's no mediumship where you're communicating with a deceased relative. That's the way I used to look at life. So when you die, it's lights out. And the whole reason that we emerged in the first place as a physical, biological being was because of random processes in a massive universe after 13.8 billion years of chemical interactions, basically, molecules bumping into each other. That's the story that I totally bought.
Yeah.
That's
you're not buying it anymore.
I'm not buying it for so many reasons, but let's just stick with the reasons, because I just wrote a book on cosmology, which is a different story.
Yeah.
But if we go to the part about the brain and consciousness, because that's the crux of where I started, and it's still where I bring all of my work back to this key point. Because like I just said, consciousness is essential to our experience. If we didn't have a consciousness, we couldn't ask these questions or have a conversation like this. And the conventional belief system, which I had, and I didn't even know I had it because it's so ingrained in our thinking, is that our consciousness pops out of our brain. Because our brain, it's so complex and there's all kinds of chemical and electrical activity going on. At some point when our brain became complex enough, consciousness popped out. It's known in philosophy as an epiphenomenon. Consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain activity. That's what I believed without even knowing it. My major at Princeton was psychology, so I had to take some neuroscience. I didn't even know this was an issue. It's just built into it's like a presupposition that's so deeply ingrained, you don't ask about it. But when I started to do this research, initially I came across, psychic phenomena and people communicating with other dimensions and those sorts of things. The common theme in all of those was that something in the person's consciousness was happening beyond their brain, meaning that the consciousness wasn't located in the brain in terms of space and time and wasn't produced by the brain. That's really the key point. So let me take a step back here, because your audience members might be a little bit confused like I was, because we know from the entire field of neuroscience that there's a strong correlation between what happens in the brain and the type of conscious experience that we have. For example, if a person gets in a car accident and has brain damage, in particular, maybe the person has brain damage in the part of the brain responsible for vision, and then the person has a change in his or her eyesight, we can say, wow, here's where your brain changed. Here's where your conscious experience changed. Look at how important the brain is, because the brain is correlated with your conscious experience. And that's not something I'm denying. And even people who question mainstream consciousness, they don't deny the correlation. The question is, does correlation give us enough to say that there's causation? Meaning, is it the case that because the brain is so closely related to consciousness, that the brain creates consciousness? Or is there another explanation? And I'll give an analogy that I first heard from Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher. He said that when you have a large fire, there are lots of firefighters that show up at the scene. Do we conclude, because of this correlation between the size of the fire and the firefighters, that the firefighters caused the fire? No, we don't, because we have more information about the situation. No. So is it the case that just because the brain's related to consciousness, that the brain creates it? No, maybe there's another explanation. And this is where my first book is about this, and into upside down thinking, and I get into it into an ends upside down living too, where maybe the brain is like an interface for consciousness, meaning consciousness is beyond the physical body. I'll give you an example. Imagine that you're watching television, and the reason you're able to watch the show on TV is because there's an antenna that's picking up a signal, and the signal has information that your antenna processes, and you're able to watch this complex thing on your screen. It's a television show. And then you take a hammer and you smash the antenna and you break it. All of a sudden, the TV show that you're watching, it's not clear on the screen anymore. But it's not because the signal that has the information was damaged. It's because the apparatus that was responsible for processing the signal was damaged.
Yeah.
So that
All
might
that
be
is out there in the universe. All the information is there.
it's there, and we are somehow tapping into it.
Right.
And so that, Gale, was huge for me. Whoa. That means is my body is tapping into something outside of me, and I didn't know that. So the recontextualization is, what does it mean to be a human being? There's some part of my essence, that's what this science is suggesting, that exists beyond my physical body. I didn't know that about myself. That's crazy. All these other people around me who are so intelligent, they don't know that. Could it be true? So when I started to realize this was a possibility, I wanted to see if there was evidence that would support it. And that's what especially my earlier books get into, is all these different pieces of evidence. And I can give a few now, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, just give a couple.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one that really has been convincing for me is the near-death experience.
Yeah.
And these are instances in which a person has some kind of major physiological trauma, like cardiac arrest. Blood stops flowing to the brain. By all normal standards, the person is clinically dead. And yet when they come back sometimes, when they're resuscitated, they report a consciousness that they had that was realer than real, at a time when the brain shouldn't have been capable of producing that. So when I have a podcast series that I produced in 2019 called Where Is My Mind? And I interviewed Dean Radin from IONS and many others like Dr. Bruce Grayson from UVA. And he said to me, we're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. That's the paradox of the near-death experience. You've got no brain and you've got a highly functional consciousness. Now, the type of experience, however, within the near-death experience that's been super convincing for me, it's called a veridical out-of-body experience, where the person's consciousness, while clinically dead or close to it, is hovering over the person's body, sometimes even outside the room. And upon being resuscitated, the person gives accurate information about what happened at the time from a vantage point of being outside the body. This is important because we can timestamp when the memory occurred and know what the person's physiology was doing, and we can get validation from the doctor, from family members who were there. And when those other parties, the bystanders, say, yeah, what you told me during that time that your brain was off, yeah, you gave me accurate information. It's not a hallucination at that point. So that's very significant. You have a non-hallucinatory memory occurring at a time when the brain's off. That suggests that the brain or consciousness can function independently of a brain.
Yeah, there's a lot of research now about the things that they say while a person is under. And they're very, very careful to talk about, to not say anything. And I know many people will have, I had a friend of mine who had a recording, a hypnosis recording. They let her have that while she was in the operating room. So, the conscious mind is not available, but consciousness is. And here's what's going on. So
Right.
that's very, that is, they know that now. They didn't know that before.
It challenges so much of what we think about a human being.
Totally. Yeah, so this is really fascinating, because I've been obsessed with near-death experiences and what we know about them as result of people have those experiences, and what is death, and recognizing that there is a beyond death that we have. So so when we come back, I'd like to go more into the idea of the one mind, which you talk about in your book a lot, and how can we really create the reality that we're talking about, So it's the upside down thinking is recognizing that there's a different reality that we've been given. And
Yes.
that we are the reality that is the common societal understanding of reality is really not true. So that's why my radio show is called Reality Reimagined.
Love it.
Reimagining what reality actually is. Right. Okay. When we come back, we'll have Mark Gober. We're going to go more into how you can do an upside up living, or how do you call it?
A right side up
A
living.
right side up living, and really live a life that is in alignment with you and what truly is reality. And we'll be back in a flash. Thank you. Tune into Reality Reimagined on Transformation Talk Radio to expand your mind, elevate your spirit, and transform your world into something truly awesome. Reality Reimagined is an exciting, out-of-the-box adventure into what's new, what's old, and what's emerging. We are on the precipice of one of the most exciting evolutionary shifts in human history. Together with global thought leaders, we will explore who are we and who are we becoming. For more information, visit successwithsoul.com.
Imagine if you were truly flourishing, how would your financial expansion impact the world? Author of Money Come Dance With Me, Gale West is an internationally known speaker, creative catalyst, and business intuitive at Success with Soul. Work with Gale to create a new relationship with money as your friend. Link the soul of your business to the business of your soul with programs like Sacred Money Mastery, Akashic Records of the Soul, and more. To receive a healing money meditation, go to successwithsoul.com today. And I'm Gale West, and we are back on Reality Reimagined. I have my guest, Mark Gober. We've been talking about fascinating things like what exactly is reality. We've been talking about his journey to his upside down journey of understanding reality. And so we're going to go a little bit more into his sense of, your sense, Mark, of where we are as far as looking at reality from a different perspective and how we can live our lives from that perspective. You call it right side up thinking instead of upside down thinking.
Yes.
Living. Yeah, right.
Well, let me also give the context for this. I wrote my first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, which is mostly the science of consciousness and the idea that consciousness does not come from the brain, and near-death experiences, just like we spoke about, and also psychic spying and telepathy, many, many other phenomena, children with past life memories. To just hammer home, this is not just someone's idea. There is science suggesting that we have to rethink all of reality. But then I was often asked by people, okay, Mark, that's great. I think you're right. There's a lot of science here, but then what should I do in my everyday life? What's the then what after this? How do I live? So that's the next book, An End to Upside Down Living, was an exploration into that. How do we become in alignment with this new picture of reality? And in that process, I studied a lot of spiritual awakening journeys, because arguably I had a spiritual awakening journey. It was a very intellectual one. Others might have it through meditation or something else. But there are many commonalities in those journeys. And there's something about orienting one's consciousness with this picture of reality. And what's this picture of reality? I've alluded to it, but I want to be more explicit. The idea that consciousness does not come from the brain is an important first step. So there's something beyond the brain that we're tapping into. The body's maybe a vessel for this broader consciousness, perhaps. But what's even beyond that? So where's the consciousness coming from? And I think the answer is perhaps beyond human comprehension, but there are some frameworks that do seem to fit the data. And my favorite one, you've mentioned it, I call it the one mind framework, but it comes from Erwin Schrödinger, a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He said, in truth, there is only one mind. And it also relates to a quotation from Max Planck, another Nobel Prize winning physicist, who said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness.
Okay. Say that again. That's really important.
Yeah, I regard consciousness as fundamental, Max Planck said. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness.
Yeah.
Meaning that everything we perceive in the world is actually a manifestation of consciousness rather than what we've been taught, which is that everything is material And consciousness emerges through human bodies, through the brain, and pops out at the very end. So this is the upside down thinking that I was referring to. It's not that matter gives rise to consciousness. It's the other way around, is that consciousness is fundamental and it gives rise to everything we call matter. And I know it sounds very abstract. So one analogy I really like, it comes from, again, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He says that imagine that all of reality is like a stream of water, an infinite stream, where water is analogous to consciousness. Each of us as a human being is like a whirlpool within that infinite stream.
Mm-hmm.
So you're one whirlpool, Gale, I'm another one, and so forth. Meaning that each of us as a whirlpool is an individuation of the broader consciousness. And at the same time, we're connected to the broader consciousness. So the one mind framework is this one single stream of consciousness that we're all a part of. And one of the key tenets of this framework is interconnectedness. So even though you and I are separate whirlpools, so to speak, we're interconnected as part of the same stream. So everything that happens to the stream matters. And if I'm affecting the stream through my whirlpool, that matters for the entire stream. And the same goes for everyone else. So that's a huge shift in one's orientation for life. I mean, at least based on my experience, going from the materialist perspective, which is it's all just matter and consciousness pops out of my brain. And when my body dies, that's the end of my consciousness and it's all random and there's no meaning, to no, the body is a temporary individualization or localization of consciousness. Like, let's say one whirlpool in the stream stops being a whirlpool. What happens? The water flows back into the stream. The analogy here is that when the human body dies, the individualization of consciousness, when that dies, all that happens is that the consciousness flows back into the broader stream. It changes into a new form, but it doesn't leave the stream itself. So for me, whoa, okay. So maybe if some part of me continues, how do I think about living life? And if my actions affect the rest of the stream, how do I think about living life versus what I used to think, which is that I'm an individual, you're an individual, and that's it. That's partially true to me still, but it misses the interconnectivity. So that's where, to me, the reorientation of my compass started to shift.
Well, it's interesting because our culture, especially in America, is very, very individualistic. And I lived in China for a while, and that's a very different culture where they recognize that it's about the group, and that there's not one person being the one, but recognizing that one person affects the whole group. And so there's more of a collective consciousness than there is in America. And I think that we think about it, it's kind of one of the dreams, the false dreams that we're living in the Western world, that we can do whatever we want and that it doesn't matter, and recognizing that we are responsible for the world we create, and our thoughts are more powerful than we know. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, and it also leads to a number of paradoxes. One is that our identity is at some level an individual, and another level it's not an individual. So the individual, to ignore the individual would be a mistake because the individual is still part of the stream. That would be irresponsible. But then to ignore the collective would be irresponsible too. So there's this paradox of being one and not being one and not ignoring either that gets lost without this framework.
Yeah, and the interconnectivity of all things. So I'm and that idea that together we can be more than we can be apart.
Yes.
And that when we come together for an idea of movement, that there's a movement that happens where that collective consciousness takes over and becomes greater than
and that this is a reality that we exist within, not just an idea that sounds nice. That was really the big point for me that switched me up. No, we live in this reality, whether we like it or not. That's just how this is structured. That's what all the science seems to be pointing toward.
Yeah. So I take a deep breath. I'm taking a deep breath and I'm inviting my audience to just sit with what we've been talking about, that this is reality. It's not the reality that we've been taught, but the reality is that we are all connected. We are all part of this larger one mind, that we are an individual within the context of this one mind, and the one mind is all, right?
Right.
And what I know and what you talk about in the book is that the fundamental energy that it radiates is love.
Yes, that one of the qualities inherent in the one mind, the infinite stream of consciousness, is unconditional love.
Yeah.
And where did I come up with that? And because we hear it so often, but to me, we can infer that based on real data, and it comes
I
from.
love how you love data.
That's how I think about things, Gail.
Yeah,
And also,
I know you do.
but also the world that I was coming from, like when I wrote my first book and I was still working, if I was going to write a book on things that sounded so crazy, I needed to have evidence for every
Right.
little thing.
Right.
So that's how I approach it. And I used to be in boardrooms where anything I said could be under scrutiny. So I have that defensive mentality somewhat.
I love it. I love it.
So that's how I'm looking at this. How can I back up this thing that sounds crazy?
Right.
And I do think there's data and evidence. And it
Okay.
comes from a host of mystical experiences that people have through their own direct experience. And by the way, these have been happening throughout human history. We can see it in religious and spiritual lore everywhere. And it's happening all the time now. So what's a mystical experience? A near-death experience is one example, which we just talked about. The person's clinically dead, and yet their consciousness is having a realer than real experience. It's so real that they actually can't even use words to describe it. That's what they say. Meditation experiences, sometimes through breathing exercises, sometimes through psychedelics. Sometimes it can happen spontaneously. People have these mystical states. There's a podcast that I refer to a lot in the book in End Upside Down Living. It's called Buddha at the Gas Pump, hosted by Rick Archer. He interviews many people who have had these experiences, and there's just so many commonalities when you listen to interview after interview. And what do the people say when they're in these we'll call them higher states of consciousness? That I was just immersed in unconditional love. I felt the oneness. Now, I personally haven't had a direct experience like this, but it's interesting when people read my books, I get validation from them because they'll say, Mark, I appreciate the science, but I actually experience what you're talking about, and I can validate for you that this is what happened. Like people from all different walks of life will say this to me. And they talk about the interconnectivity that they directly experienced and a state of unconditional love that's really not describable. So what seems to be the case then is that when people are in this mystical state and consciousness is actually liberated from the confines of the brain and the body, because that seems to be a commonality too, is that somehow our body restricts a broader consciousness. It's like seeing a little sliver. It's like having a blindfold on. And then when the near-death experience happens and the brain's fully out of the way, consciousness is liberated and the blindfold is taken off. And people will talk about these higher states of interconnectivity and being one with everything and being in a state of unconditional love. That there's something about the broader consciousness that is actually made of unconditional love. And what we experience in the world is just an obstruction of that. So an analogy from one of my favorite philosophers, David Hawkins, he talks about like consciousness being the sun. It's always shining rays. And what happens is that there are clouds that get in the way. And the path to enlightenment, i.e. the path to reuniting our consciousness to these higher states of interconnectivity and unconditional love, is by removing the clouds. So it's actually not obtaining something to reach an enlightened state. It's subtracting. It's getting rid of the obstructions.
I think it's coming home to your essence.
Yeah.
And the essence, I talk about original innocence as the knowing that we forget when we come in that we are loved, deeply and dearly loved by the divine. Always have been, always will be. And that what I think what you're talking about is reconnecting to that knowing. I remember after my stroke was really interesting. I couldn't understand what the feeling that I was having, but it was absolute delight. It's like everything was a delight. Every moment was a delight. It lasted for a number of months, and I could see people's beings walking. Their beings were outside of their body and saying hi. It was very wild.
And you're not the only one.
Yeah, it's
so
like,
many of these
hello.
reports.
Yeah, so when you have that thing where half your brain is dead for a while, those kinds of things happen.
Right.
And you talked about having a sense of bliss, also.
Yes, bliss is a common theme in these mystical states. And what we described, though, Gale, is that we seem to have a form of amnesia. Because if there's a home that exists that we only know when we reach these higher states, why is it that most of us don't remember that? Because I don't remember it. I can intellectualize for you how that could be true, but I don't personally remember it. And many of your listeners might not remember it either. Most people walking around don't remember it. So we're trying to perhaps remove the clouds. Maybe those clouds are like little bits of amnesia that the sun's always been there the whole time. It's always shining. That's the home. And we're returning to that original state, the original innocence, like you say, that can flow through us when we're not obstructed.
Right. Well, I think I don't want to say shit happens. We're a child, and then we create parts that believe we're not lovable, we're not this, we're not that. And over time, those become our reality, those become our consciousness, those become the beliefs that we live in. And then you have to remove those veils. And I think you talked a little bit about, I don't want to talk about karma, but the sense that we choose life experiences based on the spiritual gifts we want to learn about. And then so when we think about that, it has a little bit of a different meaning. And then it is about coming home to self. We forget, and then we come home. It's about coming home.
Yeah, the notion of like between lives, it's one that still intrigues me.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, because, so I'll give an example. The University of Virginia, like I said before, they've been studying young children who have past life memories, and they've studied over 2,500 of these cases. Sometimes they can find historical records that validate what this little kid is saying between the ages of 2 and 6 years old. Very specific details. The child describes something. The researchers can sometimes find the record that say, yes, that person lived. And it's not just Cleopatra. These are sometimes obscure people, like a Hollywood extra, and there are many examples of this, a World War II fighter pilot. Those are some of the most famous cases. But sometimes also the children have birthmarks or physical defects that align with how they claim to have died in the past life, and the researchers can find medical records that say, oh yes, here was a person that died in that exact manner, and so forth. But I mention that context because a percentage of those children that have past life memories studied at the University of Virginia, those kids are also talking about intermission memories of a period between lives. So they died in one life, they hadn't gone into the next body yet to quote unquote reincarnate, and they have a memory of that period. And they talk about choosing their parents. This also is reported in people, not just children, adults who have hypnosis. They go under hypnosis, and these pre-birth memories will come up. In the book, An End to Upside Down Living, I actually quoted a man who had a spontaneous pre-birth memory, and he talked about a screen of planning, of looking at all the possibilities before his life of the types of families that he could go into and what might happen if he had those parents. So these are...
it's fascinating, isn't it?
They put a new context on our timeline, because we tend to think my life started when I was born and it ends when I die. But what if there's continuation before your life and after your life? Wow.
It's interesting you're talking about that, because I had a client whose mother brought her to me, and she came in remembering a life in the Holocaust. And she was still in PTSD. And she said she opened her eyes when she was born and she saw her mother, and she knew that it had been her mother in the past life. So we had to really work with the PTSD. So imagine coming in with PTSD from another life. It was really tough. Yeah. And she said, and she moved from Chicago to Florida because she said, when I was in the Holocaust, I was always cold. Mm. And that I can't handle a cold. So that's fascinating. So this idea of remembering and the knowing that we have from many, many past lives and from many cycles that we live is really fascinating.
Let me give you one quick example, Gale, that really had an effect on me. A woman, she was a corporate attorney. She had really bad jaw pain, TMJ, and she was going to have to get surgery. The head of Columbia Dental said, we've got to operate on you. She said, I don't want to get surgery. I'm going to try alternative things. She tried past life regression hypnosis. The first time, nothing happened when she went under hypnosis. The second time, I believe it was, she had a flash memory of being a slave and had a chain around her neck, and the chain was rubbing against her jaw. And she felt a sense of powerlessness in this past life. When she remembered that, her jaw pain went away. She did not need surgery.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Wow. Interesting. You know, talking about people that have multiple personality disorders, I remember reading about how one personality can need glasses and the other personality doesn't. That's, to me, is amazing because it's the structure of the eye. How does that change? Like, hello, isn't that fascinating?
It shows that our physical biology is not the only determinant.
Right, totally. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how, excuse me, you can now be on right side up living, right? Okay. We'll be back in a flash. I'm Gale West, and we have Mark Gober as my guest. Tune into Reality Reimagined on Transformation Talk Radio to expand your mind, elevate your spirit, and transform your world into something truly awesome. Reality Reimagined is an exciting, out-of-the-box adventure into what's new, what's old, and what's emerging. We are on the precipice of one of the most exciting evolutionary shifts in human history. Together with global thought leaders, we will explore who are we and who are we becoming. For more information, visit successwithsoul.com.
Imagine if you were truly flourishing, how would your financial expansion impact the world? Author of Money Come Dance With Me, Gale West is an internationally known speaker, creative catalyst, and business intuitive at Success with Soul. Work with Gale to create a new relationship with money as your friend. Link the soul of your business to the business of your soul with programs like Sacred Money Mastery, Akashic Records of the Soul, and more. To receive a healing money meditation, go to successwithsoul.com today.
Hello, this is Gale West, and I'm back with Mark Gober, my guest, and we've been talking about amazing things such as the one mind and a reality upside down and rethinking it all. So we're going to talk now about how you can create a life of right side up thinking as opposed to upside down thinking. So, Mark, what are the keys to the kingdom here to begin to live a life of meaning, connecting to consciousness, understanding the power of our thoughts and our actions, and that next step on the journey that you've been on?
Okay, well, I'll give two examples that I think summarize a lot. One is the life review experience. This is part of near-death experiences, and it shows our interconnectivity. The second is about the notion of truth in general. So I'll start with the life review. And I actually did a full episode on this in my podcast series from 2019, if your audience is interested, called Where Is My Mind? Because this has had such a big effect on me. So the life review, this comes up in maybe 20 to 30% of near-death experience reports, where a person relives his or her whole life when they're clinically dead or close to it. But the kicker is that they become each person that they affected during their life, and they feel what it was like to be affected by themselves as the other person. Right. So in my podcast, I interviewed Daniel Brinkley, who's had multiple near-death experiences in his life. He was struck by lightning. He had open heart surgery twice and brain surgery once. And each time he had a near-death experience. And he also had a life review where he started from the beginning of his life, and he saw how other people were feeling based on his actions. He also, because of that process, he felt what it was like to be the people that he had killed in Vietnam because he fought in combat in the Vietnam War. He got to be the person that he killed, to see the pain that they experienced from their eyes. And he also felt the pain of the children that would no longer have a father because he had killed the father in combat. He said he didn't feel it quite as strongly, but he felt the indirect effects of his actions through the eyes of the children. Wow. And I could tell how affected he was because he didn't want to talk about it too much. It was causing him to be emotional, even after all these years of having processed this information.
Wow.
So what happened was when he came back from his first life review, near-death experience, he was fortunate to be resuscitated and survive all these different times. But the first one in particular, he changed his life. He became much less materialistic. He became a hospice volunteer, helping people go through the transition process themselves as they were dying, comforting them. So in his later life reviews, when he had near-death experiences, he got to feel what it was like to be the dying person in the hospice bed and to feel the joy and comfort that he brought to them. So this is a very powerful demonstration where I remember listening to one of his lectures online. It was on YouTube, and he goes, this is very selfish of me to give this talk because I know that in my life review, when I actually die, I'm going to get to see how I benefited all of you by telling you about the life review and letting you know about this now and how it positively affected your life. I'm going to feel that. So that lesson alone, it's a very simple one. I mean, some would call it the golden rule: treat other people well because we're interconnected. Treat other people the way you'd like to be treated because we're all one. That's basically the idea, which, by the way, is found in every religious culture
Yeah.
around the world.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that, because there's something that's true. Dr. Eben Alexander, a Harvard neurosurgeon, I believe he said this to me in my podcast interview, something to the effect of, the golden rule is built into the fabric of reality itself. That's what we're learning from these life reviews and the near-death experience. So that's one lesson that anyone can take in terms of, let's say, right side up living. And when I mean right side up, I mean living in alignment with the nature of reality itself. And if the nature of reality is one of interconnectivity, where the golden rule is actually baked into it somehow, then to live in accordance with the golden rule is just right side up. It's just living in accordance with reality. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that I want to mention is about the nature of truth. And David Hawkins called it radical humility. The idea that we really have to acknowledge how little we firmly know to be true.
Yeah.
And as I've analyzed this, I only think there is one thing that's true. And it's that at this moment, it feels like I'm having a conscious experience. That's the only thing I know with absolute certainty. Everything else that we could talk about, like what happened 5 minutes ago, it's an inference to some degree. I'm inferring that what happened 5 minutes ago in our conversation happened based on my memory, and my memory is happening right now in the present moment. We could do this analysis for everything about, well, I think I know this to be true, but there are all these caveats about anything. But it's important to have this mentality, because I do think that we can get stuck in a false paradigm because we just assume things to be true that we haven't evaluated. We haven't examined the assumptions or the presuppositions in things. And then we get locked into a consciousness that's based on a false or even a slightly false reality. So having this open mind to say, well, I think this is true, and this is why I think it's true, but I also acknowledge it might not be. There's something about that approach that I think is really fundamental.
Mhm.
And also it probably leads to more happiness too, when we don't get too rigidly stuck into something.
Well, what people knew was true in the 1900s, we know very differently than what is true. What people knew was true in 5000 BC is very different from what we know to be. Our understanding of the world and things change dramatically based on more and more and more information, more and more understanding, more and more of understanding reality. But it's one of the things it's Wallace Wattles. He says, this is not a bad world, but a world in the process of becoming. I love that.
Yeah.
So if we look at ourselves as being human beings in the process of becoming, and all human beings, all creation, and the world is in the process of becoming, that everything is unfolding.
Yeah, we're all growing, we're evolving, we are removing the obstructions to the sun rays, so to speak.
Right.
And we live in a world where there are lots of clouds blocking the sun, both individually and collectively, and we're all working to alleviate that. And that can be a bumpy ride sometimes, but often the periods of suffering are the ones that leads to the greatest growth. And for me, the clearest example was I was a competitive athlete. I was one of the captains of the tennis team at Princeton. And when I worked out really hard and trained really hard, yes, it was extremely painful, but then I was a much better tennis player in the end. And that analogy for me applies to so much of life. We go through things that are objectively painful or they can feel like struggle, but they end up leading to growth. And that's what perhaps we're all going through collectively.
There is a collective growth when we look around, but I think I want to come back to the idea that the golden rule and recognizing that what we do unto ourselves, what we do unto others, affects the whole. And that's the most important thing to think about, and that we are powerful beyond measure in how we affect people.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, that there's a ripple effect to our actions. This came up when I did my podcast series, Where is My Mind? I believe it was Dr. Jan Holden, who is a professor at the University of North Texas. She was talking about a life review example in which someone had a negative interaction with a cashier at a store. And in the life review, got to see the way in which that negative interaction negatively affected every other customer afterwards, because that person, that cashier, was in a worse mood. So it's something that seems like a small interaction. And on the positive side, it can be the other way, where you have a positive interaction, that person's in a relatively better mood, and then it changes someone's life. There was a story I heard, maybe it was last year or something, where someone was in like a deep depression and had a positive interaction with the cashier. And the cashier just knew that she needed to be nice. And then that person later had just a life transformation based on that nice interaction. Something that seems so small.
We don't realize how these little small things can be so big. It's not the big, big, big things. It's everyday actions and everyday thoughts and everyday. And so I get up every morning and bless all my interactions, so that and I believe blessings are an activator. We're activating something. We're blessing those people that we connect with.
Yeah,
and that's what you're talking about. So anything else? I know you've got a whole bunch of ways that people, one is non-judgmental, right?
yes.
I forget, non-attachment.
Non-attachment's a big one. That's probably the biggest one. Non-attachment.
Talk about that?
Yeah, the idea. So I think you're referring to a chapter in the book, in Upside Down Living, where I have 10 approaches to living that are in alignment with this one mind view of reality, or at least inferences that we could draw from the one mind. And the notion of non-attachment, it's distinct from detachment. David Hawkins made this distinction very often. Detachment is, well, we're all just one mind, so I'm going to sit on my couch and be detached from the world. Doesn't matter if there's suffering out there. Non-attachment is, that's one approach someone could take. I don't agree.
Yeah, right.
To be totally detached.
It's their problem. I don't have to deal with it.
Right. Everyone else can deal with it.
Yeah.
But non-attachment is to be fully engaged in the world and have desires and even have fears and be okay with that, but not be attached to the outcome, not be bound to it. Because that's when we get into trouble, where it's, I want this thing to happen. That's a desire. Or a fear is, I don't want this thing to happen. The attached part is, and if it doesn't happen exactly the way that I think it should happen, then I'm going to be miserable. That's sort of the contract that we end up making with ourselves. I want this thing so badly, or I don't want this thing so badly, that my life's happiness is dependent on the outcome. So the key is, and this comes up in so many spiritual philosophies, is to allow the desire or the fear to be there, but just be okay with whatever happens. So to try your best for the desire, and maybe to try your best to avoid the thing that you fear with 100% energy. But you say, whatever happens, happens. So I'll give you a tennis analogy, because this is how especially at high level, in such a high level, you're playing so many good players. Sometimes all you can do is you can play the point and do the strategy the best way you know how. But if your opponent hits an amazing shot, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. All I did was the best I could to execute the strategy, and I did my best. And I can't be attached to the outcome. What I can be more fixated on is, am I giving my best effort toward the thing that I desire, versus being attached to the outcome. Very subtle but important distinction.
Well, it's reminded me of Viktor Frankl's famous quote that no one can take away the last of the human powers, and that is the power to determine how you're going to react to a situation. And that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. We have an ability to react a certain way, or to not react, and to say, whatever happens, happens, but I'm going to try my best.
Yeah. So we have a few minutes left, and you have many, many books. Do you want to talk about how people can connect with you and find your podcast? Are you still doing the podcast or not?
No, it's just one 8-episode series that came out in 2019. I worked with a production company, Blue Duck Media. So this is not a podcast series where it's just me speaking with someone for an hour. It's me speaking to my producer, who is newer to this information, at least at the time he was newer to it. And we're having a conversation. And we use clips from the many people that I interviewed, just short clips, to make the points within our conversation. So there's a whole episode just on telepathy. And my producer's asking me, well, explain what telepathy is like. Oh, well, I spoke to Dr. Dean Radin. He can explain it. And it's like that, but with many different voices from different researchers and near-death experiencers. And there's music in the background. So it's catered to people who they're on the move, they're in their car working out. You can binge the whole 8 episodes. It's called Where Is My Mind? It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, anywhere you can get podcasts. But I would recommend starting at episode 1 and working toward episode 8, because there is a chronology to it and there's sequencing that we put into this. So
find your books. You have many books. Can you talk about quickly? A book on medicine, politics, blah, blah, blah.
So we talked about an end to upside down thinking and end to upside down living. There's an end to upside down liberty, which is on political and economic theory and ties in the spiritual part. There's an end to upside down contact, which is contact with non-human intelligence, including UFOs and spirits and channeling and all that. There's an end to the upside down reset, which is about the World Economic Forum's vision for society. It's more sociological and includes a talk on metaphysics too, because I think that's something that's been missing from the sociological direction. An end to upside down medicine, which is about a new paradigm or challenging the allopathic approach, including why consciousness is so important to all of this. And the most recent one is called An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, which is a new look at cosmology, including the Big Bang and much more.
Wow.
And all the books are available on Amazon in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible. I read all the Audibles myself, if members of your audience enjoy that. But you can get them on all formats. And
your website is?
My website is my name. It's markgober.com, markgober.com.
Thank you so much, Mark. This has been amazing. And I'm Gale West. This is Reality Reimagined, and we have been reimagining reality in a big, big way.
Thank you, Gale.
I hope it's been amazing. We go live every second and fourth Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 Eastern, and have a lovely, lovely day, and may you be blessed. Thank you for tuning in to Reality Reimagined with me, your host, Gale West. Listen and watch live every second and fourth Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific on transformationtalkradio.com, where you will have the opportunity to expand your mind, elevate your spirit, and transform your world into something truly awesome. Reality Reimagined is an exciting out-of-the-box look at what's new, what's old, and what's emerging, exploring the questions, who are we and who are we becoming? For more information on hope and transformation for our new reality, visit me, Gale West, at successwithsoul.com.